Dr. McAbee, welcome to Theology U, where we talk to academics and authors about God and faith in a way that anybody can understand. Thanks so much for coming on the show.
Good to be here, Will. Thanks, man.
Yeah, so what do you do regularly? What are your academic interests, and what do you spend your day doing most of the time?
What do I spend my day doing? Well, I'm professor of religion and the arts at Belmont University here in Nashville, Tennessee, and I get to teach funky, weird classes on creativity and spirituality, writing and God stuff, religion and literature. And I don't know, I've kind of carved out a little niche for what I do here. And right now I'm working on a project that also deals with changing ideas of the sacred in Americana music. So I'm also getting to explore creativity and songwriting and changing ideas, culturally speaking, in the music of who is God, what is spirituality. So that's a pretty cool niche I get to do here, I think.
Yeah, it's definitely cool. It's one of a kind, and of course this episode's going to be titled something about politics. Eventually you round out to there. So I guess the obvious question is, what inspired you to write an article that was widely published? I mean, we're talking Time magazine about politics and your faith.
My preference is to sit around and write poetry in coffee shops and to be a generally useless seeming member of society. So I love writing poetry and memoir essays. And recently, probably over the last year and a half, I've felt this urge to start engaging more directly with political topics or on the surface political topics. I mean, I think anything we do, how we interact with other humans is deeply political. But political in this instance, I think, has meant engaging in some form of critique of partisan issues in our culture. And I think the first essay I wrote that came out in Time was after the Covenant school shooting here in Nashville. And my wife had been really involved in gun safety reform measures already. She's a public school teacher before we had kids, and she's again teaching in the public schools here. And she had, quite honestly, a deeper sense of moral engagement with that issue than I did. And watching her activism grow, seeing the way the school shootings impacted her in Uvalde, seeing the way years ago when she was still teaching before we had kids full time, when she came home after a lockdown at her school, it brought home some of those issues. So over the years, I think her conscience influenced me a little bit. And then when the Covenant school shooting happened here, some of our closest friends' child was there, bullets flying by their classroom, and a family from our church lost one of their children. One of the children who was murdered that day attended our church. And that's not a family I was close with. I saw them. I knew who they were. You know, you always think, what a beautiful looking family, smiling mom and dad, 2 girls. And some of our other friends at church had children in that classroom and in other classrooms. So in that instance, you didn't have to have much of a conscience for it to hit home in a really dramatic and drastic way. And I responded to that. Kind of the only way I know to respond to things in meaningful ways is to try to write about it, you know? And so I wrote about that experience, about being in the Baptist church sanctuary across from the street from my church where the families were being reunited. And I do think that standing in a church sanctuary with about 200 or 300 parents around you waiting to find out whether their children are alive or dead is the closest experience to hell I'll probably ever have. That I hope to ever have. But it was a horrible experience, and I felt the need to write about that. And so that was the first time I think that anything I wrote felt particularly political in a sense, because I realized more viscerally than I ever had before the dangers and the deadliness of our Republican supermajority legislature here in Tennessee. and you see how these issues aren't merely ideological. They're not merely theoretical. The ways that our legislators vote in states and in our federal legislature, those things have life or death consequences. And I guess the death just got so close that time that it shook me. And since then, I've been engaging more with those types of essays that I didn't really ever see myself writing. And so, it leads up, I guess the fourth one they published is the one that you read and reached out to me. I think it was called "My Christian Faith Won't Let Me Vote for Donald Trump or His Disciples." Um, yeah. So, I mean, I think everything we do is political, political just based on polis, the city, how we interact with one another. Every day, I was talking to a friend yesterday who's Irish, and she's in the music industry here in Nashville. And she said she asked her dad when she was 10 years old, what does the word political mean? And he looked at her and he said, it means you get up in the morning and you go about your business. It's basically this notion of whatever we do is political. And that's one of the things, when I have conversations with students, I have conversations with colleagues, conversations like this, I don't think everything is partisan, but I do think everything we do is political. One of my buddies, David Dark, who I'm on faculty with at Belmont, he loves to erase the boundaries we like to put between what is politics and what is religion. And I think we can erase most all of those boundaries anyway. This isn't politics. This isn't just religion. This isn't just culture. How we choose to live and move and breathe in this world, for me as a person of faith, grows out of my Christian faith. And I try to respond to the issues that we're confronting in this moment from the perspective of my experience of the Christian faith, my understanding of it. So when it comes to writing the particular article you asked about, I had the idea for an article for a while, but I didn't want to write it. I was just kind of tired and maybe apathetic. I don't know. But my wife, again, who has a deeper moral conscience than me, clearly, she said, well, if he's elected, which he very well might be, if Trump's elected, and things do go badly, what will you tell our grandchildren that you did or didn't do when you were confronted with that moment? And I thought, my gosh, you really brought out the guilt. And she said, because we got 2 kids, man. I'm trying to finish the semester. We got 2 kids. Life's a little crazy. And she said, I'll give you the space. You just go write it. And so I did. And it got a lot of attention, and it made my inbox a very strange place to to enter. Like, oh, what crazy person has emailed me now? Because you realize what a strange public moment we're in when you can't address the ideology of a particular political figure without really grotesque ad hominem attacks. And I'm afraid that's what keeps some people from speaking up who know that they should. So I do think there's a moral imperative because this isn't just about policies. This is just base rate morality we're talking about at this point. And we're recording this just a couple of weeks into the administration, and we've seen the craziness that's come out of it. And how can you not say something? How can you not try to speak up for a morality that at least approximates what Christianity is understood to be historically, has been understood to be historically? It's kind of baffling to me. Went on a bit of a rant there. Sorry about that.
No, it's helpful. I think, we'll camp out here, I think, for most of our time, is you're making big claims, right? Which I think many Christians agree with, many Christians don't agree with. To say that it's obvious or that it's a moral problem with President Trump is something that a lot of Christians simply would flat out deny. And many Christians would say that Trump is the answer to their prayers, right? That Trump is the defender of America that they've been praying for. So how do you, I guess I would just ask for you to just explain a little more why it's so clear to you what it is about Trump and the Trump movement that to you is so problematic, that positions you to make such confident claims. Because I'm not surprised you got a lot of blowback when Trump has many Christian religious leaders at his events, speaking, praying for him.
Hmm.
So maybe just give a little more perspective from where you're sitting.
Well, I think one of the sad parts for me is I'm a child of evangelicalism. That's not the corner of our faith where I find my spiritual home now. And I like to say, I'm not an academic expert on evangelicalism. I'm a survivor of evangelicalism.
Hmm.
I'm still haunted by the worst parts of its theology. And yet there was so much beauty in aspects of American evangelicalism and of the version of it that I grew up in a small town in the upstate of South Carolina, in a Southern Baptist church. And what I see now is the evangelical church, by and large, the white evangelical church in America, betraying the best parts of its roots, betraying the best parts of its spiritual heritage to sell itself out for political power. And that's what makes me sad and angry. And to see how this version of Christianity that attempted to faithfully engage with culture in a meaningful way, and that's the best of evangelicalism. I would say that and you need an academic expert to make these distinctions better than me. But there was a slight difference for maybe 30 or 35 years mid-century between fundamentalism and evangelicalism. And I don't think there's a distinction anymore. And I think the primary drivers of evangelical Christianity, of white evangelicalism, tend to be grounded in the Southern versions. The loudest voices tend to be those. And maybe it's the specter of the fundamentalist roots of parts of that spirituality. But they've sold out the better parts of their tradition in exchange for political power. And they've turned a very spurious political figure into a Messiah figure, into an idol. And the fact that it's easily demonstrable that he's an idol because you can't critique his policies without being attacked for attacking him. And the way that his followers feel your critiques of him and his policies as personal affronts to themselves. And I've been trying to wrap my head around what all needed to happen for this moment to occur. And obviously you have the roots of some of this in Jerry Falwell and Pat Robertson and these big figures, the moral majority, Ralph Reed, all of these movements coming from the 70s into the 80s. You see the alignment of right-wing Christianity and right-wing politics in America. So these factors have been happening for 45, 50 years now, especially. And the other thing that I think I'm landing on, and this is just me reflecting on my own personal experience as a child of evangelicalism, is when you have churches whose polity is based on the charisma of one leader. You don't have the balances, the power that you have in a Presbyterian or an Episcopal structure. You have churches built around a charismatic leader, so that I think the authoritarianism that we see in forms of evangelical Christianity is also now ones that we see we're moving towards in our political life by and large. And what strikes me as a Baptist, that the Baptist roots are about the sole competency of the believer. They're about the priesthood of all believers. And so at its roots, this is why the early Baptists in this church pushed back against the other settlers that were trying to, in the Massachusetts colony, charge Native Americans a church tax. They said, no, we have freedom of conscience here. And yet, how far have we fallen from those Baptist distinctives? I don't know. So I have a lot of sadness about these things. And I hope, like that essay in some of my writings, there's a sense of anger, but I hope it's not blind self-righteousness on my own part. I want to examine my own conscience to see where my critiques are coming from, but that's just kind of how I see it. It was in the evangelical church that I learned that God loves me and wants me to have a relationship with God. It's in the evangelical church that I was told that we have freedom of conscience like that. It was in the evangelical church where my mom took me and other kids to minister to and love on Laotian refugees that were in my county in South Carolina. And it's that same evangelical church now that is trying to wage war against empathy and race bait immigrants because their leader tells them to. And there's not a significant pushback saying, hey, is this actually what Christ has called us to live out in this country in this moment? This not just lack of empathy, but a war on empathy. It's just mind-boggling to me.
Yeah, I also have a lot of sadness about it and a lot of confusion for how people in the same faith tradition or following the same God with the same book, with the same scriptures, the same mottos, like you said, priesthood of all believers, the same care for the needy, the same activism, can land on such unbelievably different political views in terms of electorate. To think, just like you're saying and then I guess I want to ask you about, you brought up the ad hominem problem earlier, which of course is getting personally attacked for your arguments rather than on the basis of the actual argument. Why do you think that is so pervasive? So, for example, you write an article saying you feel like you can't vote for Donald Trump, and you get people attacking you as a person.
Yeah.
Why?
It's lazy. It's cheap. It's a shortcut to critical thinking. Yeah. And you have, we have a president now who is a master of scapegoating and a master of avoiding nuance. And there is a tradition of anti-intellectualism in American culture in general and in evangelicalism in particular. And I think that also contributes to this lack of nuance and to this leaning on ad hominem arguments, because faith, politics, all of these things as a culture and as a subculture of evangelicalism within that, we want shortcuts to difficult thinking. When I went to Baylor, the pastor of my Southern Baptist church in Inman, South Carolina, said, now I want you to beware of those liberal religion professors that are going to be there when you get there. Now, me telling a student at Harvard Divinity School that someone told me to beware of the liberal religion professors at Baylor, it sort of shows you, what context you're in determines some of that. But I remember thinking, I had too many questions for that pastor anyway, even when I was 17. He hated my questions. It was clear my questions were not welcome. My questions were not to be entertained out loud. And most of them at that point were about women in ministry. I mean, we're nowhere near talking about LGBTQ rights and LGBTQ people feeling called to ministry, what that would look like. In my small Southern Baptist church in South Carolina, it was even asking about women in ministry was a threat to his authority and his power, and he wouldn't have it. So, I go off to Baylor with big questions and a war because I was intellectually curious, because I was a nerdy little kid, like all the kids that study religion at Wheaton and study religion at Baylor. And yet I still had this other part of me that's like, am I supposed to feel bad for asking these questions, And I remember, at 18 years old, I understood so little about life that almost anything could have felt like an epiphany. But at 18 years old, I remember as a freshman thinking, if the God of the universe, who created everything, is threatened by the questions of an 18-year-old kid, that's not really much of a God, And just having that realization that shouldn't have taken me any mental toil to get to, but it did because of the intellectual milieu of the form of evangelicalism I grew up in. Just coming to that freed me to ask questions. And it freed me to then, a year later, find a Baptist congregation in Waco that didn't simply allow questions, but encouraged questions. So I had at Baylor, it was a CBF church with a female pastor, Reverend Julie Pennington Russell. I had a a healing experience of church and of being
Mm.
Baptist, which at that point in my life was still important to me to find, oh, there are other ways, not just to be Christian, but even other ways to be Baptist, because coming from a small town in South Carolina, even the Methodists were suspect. Are they really Christian? They seem it. I don't know. I'm mostly kidding there, but Presbyterians were certainly questionable in Inman, South Carolina in the 90s.
Yeah, and I have I have a somewhat similar story, and I think that's where my sadness comes from. Is I like you, I had big questions, and I went somewhere where I could ask them,
Yeah.
and I have lots of friends to this day who are some enthusiastic, some reluctant supporters of Trump, some
Yeah.
public, some private.
Yep.
And I just can't get there. And like you said, I
I
don't
should hope
have
not.
I don't have a superiority
Yeah.
complex to that. I don't have any kind of I know better. I cannot in good conscience put a stamp on him for a variety of reasons, which
Yeah.
we could get into. I don't think we need to.
Yeah.
But it makes me really confused.
Mm-hmm.
It still does. Makes me so
Mm-hmm.
confused how that apprehension to supporting him seems so strong in some Christians, and yet others are so enthusiastic about it.
Mm-hmm.
And so I guess I would ask someone for someone listening who voted for Trump and doesn't feel bad about it. And they may argue with us and say, I have no reason to feel bad for this. You guys are liberal guilting me for it.
Oh,
There's an
yeah.
argument there. So what would you say if you were to defend your disdain for Trump? What are some of the arguments you say to explain why you are so disgusted by the movement to a Christian who voted for him and said, I think this is a force for good? How do you kind of explain your hesitancy and your issues with it?
Well, on one level, I just want to sort of begin by saying, can we convince someone of this or that position on this political figure at this point? I'm not sure.
Yeah.
But I do feel like our public Christian witness matters to the point that we should have these conversations publicly, if for nothing else than for what it will look like to try to build back after the damage that he continues to do to our country. Does that make sense?
Mm-hmm.
And like you said, I have so many people in my life who voted for Trump, who many very vociferously, many of my family members. And the first time around, I have this one of my cousin's husband, funny guy. He would make it a point of wearing like MAGA gear to the family reunion if he knew I was going to be there. And I felt it as love. It was a playful thing. It was not a malicious thing. It was a playful thing. And it feels like all of that can't be playful quite anymore to me. I don't feel it as playful at this time. Back then it was kind of, oh, okay. But when you see someone who is so baldly in love with their own authority, authoritarian, someone who so recklessly resists the rule of law, like not just a law that's unconscionable, but like actual laws that help us function as a democracy. When you see someone who race baits to try to divide us, someone who turns compassion into a dirty word because the God that they serve is power. I would just keep pointing those things out. I don't know. It's like, what is the point of saying these things? Well, I just think our witness as Christians matters to the point that we have to say these things publicly, even if we have no hope of winning the day in this moment. Does that make sense?
Mm-hmm.
I remember reading James Cone, and when I first read James Cone, I was kind of overwhelmed, I'm like, hey, can you just not say Whitey so many times? Because you read his early work, there's so much anger. And the older I've gotten, the more I've understood or been able to, sympathize with his anger based on how this country treated him.
Hmm.
I still certainly disagree with him on a lot. But one of the messages, I think it was A Black Theology of Liberation, drove home to me, one of the many, was that the church's job is not to be successful, but to be faithful. And so, I certainly know I'm not going to be successful in making my argument at this moment, but I do feel like I'm called to be faithful to who I understand Christ to be, to who I understand God to be, and to try to live in such a way as to honor that towards how I live with other people. And one of the things you were talking about earlier, there's a divide sometimes, it seems like, in the evangelical mind between personal piety and public policy. So to where I think people can keep those separate in some way. So like so many of the people I know who are huge Trump supporters are on a person to person level much better people than me, much more generous people than me, giving, loving, caring. And yet there seems to be something in the ways that they can move through the world that separates their personal piety, good as it is, with the recognition that these public policies have dire consequences for people. And again, I don't want to sound arrogant. I don't want to sound self-righteous, but it's just sort of the way it is,
Yeah, and I don't think you have to apologize for sharing your conviction, which you've done. And like you've said,
Yeah.
you have a conviction, you're entitled to share it. You touched on it earlier, who God is to you.
Mm-hmm.
And I feel like that is kind of what you lean on here is who is God to you? What's his character? And then you do your best to interpret, how to go about your day. How would you articulate who is God, who is Christ to you?
Well, to me, Christ is the incarnate living God who calls us to move towards union with God in a way that impacts the way we live towards our neighbor. And when I read the New Testament, Jesus just kind of explodes any sort of nativistic, any sort of xenophobic, any sort of prejudiced version of who is my neighbor. If you can encounter them on the streets of the city you live in, they're your neighbor. Now, do I live up to that call? Oh my God, no. I'm selfish. Yes, I recognize my shortcomings, or at least a number of them, and I have dear people in my life, including my spouse, who will point out shortcomings I'm missing. But that's who I understand God to be, and who I understand me to try to live out. And God's love in this world will often be at odds with the goals of an empire, and I think that's part of the rub we're running up against now. If an empire seeks to control groups of people, that's not what love in this world tries to do. That's one thing that's been fascinating to me to sort of witness where evangelical Christians and Catholics overlap and where they don't. And, Catholics have an ethic of life that is much deeper and more historically drawn out. I have a difference of an opinion, a difference of belief when it comes to reproductive rights than my Catholic and evangelical brothers and sisters do. And yet I see the coherence that evangelicals in America and the Catholic Church have on that issue. And I always thought, what's going to happen when the issue of immigration really comes up in a big way? And so it's been interesting to see those sides part over that issue largely. Because the Catholic Church is a global church. The Catholic Church always has a bigger sense of their communion than white evangelicals do. White evangelicalism, particularly in the South, especially if you talk about something like Southern Baptists in particular, the largest Protestant group in the States, I guess still, like it's a very regionalistic understanding of what it means to be a Christian and almost even a human, whereas the Catholic Church is so much bigger, so much older, and it has a global sense. So that that immigrant coming through the border, through our southern border, Catholic bishops still feel a pastoral call to care for the immigrant in a way that evangelicals clearly, by and large, don't mind eschewing that pastoral responsibility.
Yeah, and you make the point of Jesus's family having to flee to
Yeah.
Egypt
Yeah.
along those same lines. Could you kind of carry on that? Keep
Well, let's
going.
just strike. I mean, that's just one of the crazy things to me that you see Trump in the election season and since he's been elected, not just race baiting in the grossest ways, illegal immigration, but even those who have come here legally, which shows that this isn't just about immigration status. This is just about power, and he's using the same old playbook to divide our populace along the lines of race. But it is just so striking to me that you have this story of the Holy Family taking refuge in another country to get away from King Herod, as the story goes, for safety for this child, that a large population of Christians can't read that story and can't, with some compassion, look at the undocumented children in our public schools. There's a bill that's being put up in the House, in the Tennessee legislature very soon, to try to remove the federal requirement for public schools to educate immigrant children, those undocumented immigrants. They're estimated to be around 11,000 undocumented immigrant children in public schools here in Tennessee. And so you have these people who profess Christianity, who profess to believe in a Savior who was himself at one time an immigrant fleeing death, fleeing persecution with his family. You have people who profess this coming out against the educating and nurture and care for undocumented children. It's unconscionable to me. And yet, these are members of the political party who are going to use the language of pro-family, who are going to use the language of pro-life, who are going to try to get a Bible into every place they can get, and yet still have no sense of what actually is written in that Bible about a first century homeless, itinerant, at one point refugee preacher called Jesus. Like, nothing I'm saying here is radical. Nothing I'm saying here is new. But my God, where have we come as a country? Where have we come as a group of Christians when just bare bones, basic Christian understandings of compassion are labeled as radical and are labeled as leftist? It's absurd.
Yeah, or labeled as weak or cowardly.
Yeah. Oh, come on. Yeah. Yeah.
Mm-hmm.
Yeah.
Yeah, and that is the ad hominem argument that we talked about earlier. Is here you come with a valid point that some people may disagree with, but it's certainly not a crazy radical point. It's something to be reckoned with.
Yes.
And rather than engage the conversation, you're not a Christian, you're a coward, you hate America, things like that, right?
Yes.
Which
Very
completely
strange.
shut down. Yeah, you're strange. It shuts down the conversation, right? It's a stop asking the questions type of deal.
Yeah. Yeah. It's mind-boggling and tragic, and it has dire consequences for folks who've been marginalized in our culture.
Yeah. So I guess here's the question I want to ask you then is, you hear so often the idea that America is a Christian nation, and you hear many Christians say that America should be a light to the world. America should be an example.
Mm-hmm.
How do you fit the emphasis on compassion to say, listen, we need to find a way to make this work for the marginalized? Can you fit that into a political ideology, or is that where you see your Christian faith kind of trumping a political party or a political position, and you say, I don't have a solution, but we need to make it work?
Well, I've got a few things going through my mind. I want to make sure I address all your points. I mean, on the one hand, if you do make the argument that America is a Christian nation, then maybe it's easy to justify cruelty then. Because if America is a Christian nation, then it is a nation founded on a form of Christianity that supports slavery, a form of Christianity that supports the genocide of large groups of people, a Christianity that is at its heart imperialistic, because those are all parts of our story.
Mm-hmm.
So I think, I love thinking of things as idols. It's thinking of what makes something an idol. And what makes something an idol is when you can't criticize it. Again, I think Trump has been made into an idol. I do think certain concepts of what America is and what America has been are idolatrous for Christians. When you can't question the founding of our country, when you can't honestly assess the violence that's at the heart of our founding, when you can't honestly do that, then that idea of America is an idol, and it is used in violent ways. What's interesting to me is when you start reading, I'm trying to think of, MLK, when you think of some of the civil rights leaders, what they would do in using our founding documents would be to try to use the better ideals of what America says it was, but never was. You utilize those ideals as something to move towards, something to reach towards. And so maybe when I'm thinking about the way I want to engage as a Christian in the public sphere, I think about my faith as something that is aspirational for me and hopefully would be aspirational for us as a culture. And I don't like that for a number of years. For a number of years, I haven't been able in my conscience to vote for a Republican. And I hate that fact, because when I was younger, I did. I don't always love voting for Democrats. I've left a number of places blank, but I don't like the notion that any large segment of the American church, that their vote is owned by one political party, because when we do that, we lose our right to have a prophetic voice in the culture. And when you read Paul Tillich talking about culture and theology, the goal of the church is to have a prophetic voice towards, first off, itself, so that it doesn't become what, as a good Lutheran, he would throw off on the Catholic Church historically, what it had done when it was wedded to power and didn't clean up its own house before it spoke to the culture. And for him, the church was supposed to speak prophetically to itself so that it could then speak prophetically to its culture. And I think that we should try as Christians to mirror that, so that when we find aspects on the right and on the left, all over the spectrum, that don't align with our Christian faith, we can speak out against them. But if one of these parties knows they own our vote, then we don't have any power to push back in the form of democracy as we've had it thus far. I don't want my writing to be pretending that I have it all figured out. I don't want my writing to be, again, just self-righteous rants. But I do think Christians have a responsibility to call out problematic aspects of our lives together and try to grow towards the beautiful aspects. And, I don't envy my pastor friends right now. What would it look like for pastors to get up and actually tell the truth about what's happening in our country right now on a Sunday morning? Now, on one level, that's always true, like our politics have always been problematic, but it does feel like a crisis moment that I do believe a lot of religious figures are biting their tongues about, the ones who haven't bowed the knee, to Trump. And they need to speak the truth, but it will cost them dearly if they do.
Right. In terms of some, our institutions are flawed, and they have good things, good aspects, and they have certainly ugly aspects. I guess the only way I could think about it is to say my allegiance is to Christ first, and the institution is there. But I could sever my relationship with an institution without losing my relationship with Christ. I think is the only way I can think about it, is to say, whether you're a Catholic or a Protestant or a Baptist, is to say, like you said, I learned things here, and there's beautiful things here, but I'm not eternally wedded to it in the same way that I'm wedded to Christ.
Mm-hmm.
Right? And I don't know. Would you agree with that way of explaining it?
I like that. I think, since I primarily see myself as the way I think of myself is as a a poet, a songwriter, and an essayist. And the whole poetry thing. There's a. I mean, not to be all woo about it, but there's a bit of a mystical thing. For me,
Mm-hmm.
in the way that my poetry connects me with God, gives me a space to ask questions of God, gives me an imaginative space to engage with my faith. It's analogous to prayer, So I've got that whole mystical thing going on, which is part of my Baptist upbringing, But I love that whole, it's me and God, And yet,
Mm-hmm.
my understanding of God, my experience of God has been, in Christian terms, mediated to me through the Holy Spirit, and yet it happened in those institutions. So I don't want us to think we can sever ourselves from those institutions, because so much of the way we understand God has been framed and formed in those spaces.
Mm-hmm.
And to be honest with you, I did my PhD over in Scotland, went over to St. Andrews. And there was a part of me when I moved over there that thought, thank God I don't have to listen to these Baptist arguments anymore. I'm just done with them, As I grew up Southern Baptist, ended up kind of what's called Cooperative Baptist Fellowship, more moderate group, And over there, I would go in and out of church. My mom had just died. I was depressed. So I was, kind of lost. And one of those years I was there, I would find myself going to Catholic Mass most Sunday mornings, and then going to the Baptist church in St. Andrews at night, because at night, the Baptist church, they would sing the old hymns from the 19th century and the early 20th century. And so I had this whole, I love the Catholic thing, where it's about the drama of the liturgy that moves you towards communion. Not some pastor up there spouting off every week what they believe totally, but moving you towards communion. And I never took communion. I'm not Catholic. I wasn't going to do that. But then at night, I needed those songs that tied me back to who I was and where I'm from. So when I moved to Nashville, I ended up going to a Disciples of Christ church. And again, even though I teach at Belmont was a historically Baptist school that split with the Baptists in about 2007, I believe, about 4 years before I got there. Even then, I thought, they can have those arguments. I don't want to engage with this. I don't want to spend any more of my life, any more of my time thinking about these things. And part of that was just, I think, we overuse the word trauma right now, but I do think I experienced a form of religious trauma. And I think part of me wanting to sever myself from all of that was a trauma response, and yet I found it a pastoral responsibility for me, because of my responsibilities to them as their educator, as their professor, to engage with them where they were. And it drew me back into these conversations that I did not want to be part of. So that whole, I think sometimes if your experience of religion, I don't mean just but whoever's listening, if your experience of religion, your religious upbringing is nothing but traumatic, then you probably do just need to cut that off. But for me, so many people whom I love dearly, who shaped me, who I just care for, are still part of that movement in a way that I see as perilous for their religious development and their understanding of God. And evangelicalism, white evangelicalism, is still such a powerful force in our country, in our electorate, that I can't just say, it's not a conversation I'm interested in anymore. I wish I could on a selfish level, but I haven't been able to, because I'm an American living in this moment where I do. And if this is where I'm going to live and where I'm going to be, then to respond faithfully to what I understand my vocation to be, I'm going to have to engage in these conversations.
That makes sense to me. It's sort of a begrudging responsibility.
Yeah, I would much rather just go away and write my little poem somewhere and not write these stinking essays. But writing is about not just formulating what you think, but discovering what you think.
Mm,
One of my professors at seminary said, "I don't know what I think until I write it." And I feel about my creative writing, so-called creative writing, like the poetry and the memoir bits. I don't understand what I believe until I write it, But that's what the exercise of these essays has been. Is I want to formulate a thoughtful response to this portion of the church for this moment that we find ourselves in. And again, I don't want any of this to sound arrogant. I don't have it figured out.
mm,
I'm just trying to say, hey, can we just be a little more Christian as a church in our public witness?
mm.
Yeah. Yeah.
Yeah. So then, last question: How do you see it? How do you see it playing out? Four
God help.
years, 6 years from now, because the goal isn't division. I certainly don't get that sense from you. It's not my goal. I have no issue going to church with people with different political views than me. It doesn't bother me. I can worship alongside them.
Yeah. Oh yeah.
Now I do want the flourishing of all people as best we can accomplish, and I want to live out my Christian values. And we may agree on the application of those things. But we're in a world now where lots of people who disagree with you politically would say, I don't want to go to church with you because you think so differently than me. And that scares me, the division of it. So how do you see it playing out? Do you think about that? Does it make you excited or worried?
I think, again, I'll just fall back on that notion that we are not called to be successful. We're not called to fail, but we are called to be faithful.
Mm-hmm.
And so I will try to continue to grow in my faith and my understanding of God, my understanding of what I'm called to do in this moment where I live. We go to a church that's a so-called purple church, where red and blue ideological people all mix. And so far, we've made it work as a congregation. And I appreciate that. I don't want us to exist just in silos. And I think, culturally speaking, one role the church could play that's helpful is if it could demonstrate that we don't just, that the lines that are drawn in Christianity don't simply mirror the ideological lines of our culture.
Mm-hmm.
I think it's harder and harder for congregations to do that. The senior pastor at the church I go to now has been a friend of mine since Princeton Seminary, and I would say he's a more moderate to middle of the road to right leaning a bit. And one of the things I've admired about him is historically on our pastoral staff, he's had staff members who are politically and theologically to the left and to the right of him. Because what we try to do at my church is practice a form of big tent Christianity that says Jesus is, we believe that Jesus is the Christ, the Son of the living Lord, and our personal Lord and Savior. It's pretty disciples of Christ, old school disciples of Christ kind of things. And in terms of disciples of Christ, it's a very moderate church. But we have gay people who worship at our church, and we have people who think that's a sin. And somehow or other, we've been able to manage a communion that attempts to be a big tent. And part of that, our leadership has made possible. That buddy of mine who's our pastor, I don't know many pastors who would hire people to the left and right of them politically and theologically. And so I think he and I disagree on quite a number of things, vociferously, and often over a whiskey and a cigar. But I appreciate that his ego isn't so fragile that he only needs a staff that mirrors his political and theological ideology. And I think, however, that a lot of pastors are like that, whether they're the left or the right. They don't want to be challenged theologically or ideologically. But the fact that so far our pastor has gone this route to say, wherever you are theologically and ideologically, all of these things, you could see them represented on our staff. Mm. And I think that's helped us all feel like everybody's still got a voice at the table and a sense that the table's big, Mm. And so far we've made it. It's messy. And yet that's still at this point where I find myself at home spiritually, with my family, and we'll see what the next few years bring for all
Yeah.
of us, I suppose. But
Yeah.
faith,
I think my favorite line from any podcast episode so far was Amy Peeler saying that God's table is abundant.
yeah,
God's not a God of scarcity. The Christian God is not a God of exclusion, and there's only so much. And if you get more, then someone else gets less. He's a
Yep.
God of abundance. And
Yep.
that's what I've kind of been leaning on lately, is to think,
yeah,
he's not going to run out of grace, blessings, whatever you want to
yep,
look to. So that's been
yep,
comforting for me, at least.
yeah. And if we can lift up that understanding of God, that is absolutely mirrored at the table where Jesus breaks the bread and offers the drink, then I think we as Christians can demonstrate to our culture a better way to live, than our culture seems to be offering us at this moment. I think that's gospel, if churches can do that. And God, I wish more churches were lifting up that understanding of God and that understanding of the table and that understanding of what it means for Christ to come and to offer himself to us, and invite us, therefore, to do likewise for others.
Yeah, agreed. Well, thanks so much for sharing, being open, and being honest.
Thanks for inviting me. I hope there's something there you can use.
Oh, I'm sure there's plenty. I really appreciate you coming on. Thanks so much for the time.
Take care, Will.